First of all, I would like to thank God for the opportunity of being here today. Thanks for the organization. Thank you, Lola, for inviting me. And thank you, President Cast, for making this possible. And I like the way it sounds, President Cast. Well, we are short in time, so let me tell you that in the year 1992, Francis Fukuyama said that the end of history had come, since after the fall of communism would come an advent of a peaceful society where democratic peace would be a rule. A short time later, reality destroyed Fukuyama's prediction, causing him to admit that he was wrong. The world had continued its constant conflict, given that in the absence of Soviet Marxism, terrorism, and progressivism ideology arose as the new threats that Judeo-Christian civilization must face. As you know, I come from Chile, which is located in South America. My country is experiencing an historical process. In 2019, we experienced a social revolt triggered by the forces of the radical left with the aim of breaking any notion of institutional order as well as social composition that includes Christian perspectives on culture, freedom, and family. It was made to believe that if a new constitution was dictated, the problems in Chile would end. The result is that today my country, under a far-left government led by President Boric, the proposal of a separatist and extremely progressive constitution is months away, given that the Constitutional Convention has an overrepresentation of leftist constituents. In it can be found from activists of gender theories, street artists, to people who name as legitimate to certain terrorist actions that qualify them as a representation of political action of indigenous people. The setting is unnerving and bleak, but also challenging. For example, among the proposals that are part of the text that citizens must approve or reject as the new constitution, it is possible to find a constitutional enshrined abortion without time limits or grounds, the totalitarian imposition of gender ideology and radical feminism in all spheres of life, from justice to the education of children, the elimination of religious freedom and the reduction of freedom of speech through gag laws, the establishment of the basis of an indigenous legislation that seeks to divide the country into different autonomous government entities which threaten equality before the law, mechanisms that enshrine the impunity of terrorists and criminals. All this package of rules will be voted on in September of this year. And as you can see, these are rules that violate the most basic common sense that we possess. Sounds this familiar to you? Well, Chile is just one more small part of this process of global social deconstruction that ideological progressivism has been carried out in recent years. Therefore, today we must be more courageous than ever to raise our voice in order to defend the truth and justice. We are heirs of the Judeo-Christian civilization, in which the teaching of natural law is a cornerstone, which teaches us that human beings have dignity and a natural orientation to search for human flourishing. That flourishing is found primarily in the shelter of a family, where parents and not the state are who love, care for, and educate their children. This flourishing is possible to be reached in a society that works as a community that respects justice and order, in which people own the fruit of their own work, where the openness of transcendence and spirituality is respected as an essential aspect of human being. Finally, and above all, where the rule of law prevails, ensuring that all citizens can live freely and with dignity, knowing that their rights must be respected. Today, proclaiming and defending the values that I have mentioned, and we have all talked about these years, proclaiming that in the public sphere involves an enormous risk. It involves the risks of being treated as retrograde, messianistic, and discriminatory. And ultimately, it risks being censored and sanctioned by the deconstruction jurisprudence that has been infecting the codes of Western countries in the last few decades. Given this inauspicious scenario, the question that arises is the following: is this worth fighting for truth and justice? I want to answer this question with an example of two great men in history who decided not to surrender before evil and to become in torches in the dark. The first one, a young Hebrew in captivity, who had the responsibility of representing his people against the imperial power of his time. This is the prophet Daniel. He was tempted and then forced to be influenced by the goodness of Babylon, to the point that he was sentenced to death for refusing to betray the most valuable thing he had, submission to God, which was to Daniel the representation of truth and justice. Due to the courage and integrity of the prophet, the power of the empire had to recognize his transgression, and the people of Israel were inspired not to lower their arms in the midst of oppression in which they lived. Second, in another time and latitude, Abraham Kuyper, Prime Minister of Netherlands and founder of the Free University of Amsterdam, at the beginning of the 20th century was faced with the dilemma: hyper-individualistic liberalism or statist Marxism? The answer, he said, none of them, since both remove from the center a key idea of the Judeo-Christian West. A prosperous country is the one that is sustained by cohesive families with principles and values that promote service and the common good without distinction. That contra-revolutionary idea of Kuyper caused him to face strong opponents. Faced with adversity and friendly fire, he responded, and I quote, "And it was of no avail to look upon our little power or the superior might of our opponents at the absurdity of such a daring attempt. The fire continued to burn in our bones. There was one mightier than we who urged and spurred us on. We could not rest in spite of ourselves. We had to go forward." End of quote. The lesson can be drawn from the examples of Daniel and Kuyper is one lesson of hope. Because despite the fact that they lived through difficult and dark times, their life was a testimony to others, and their example was a seed whose fruit changed the societies of their time. In consequence, without any doubt, it is worth being brave and not lowering our arms in defense of truth and justice. But today it's our time. We have the task now of being beacons of hope in our battered world. We must guide others in this battle and be a reference in the various roles that we have in our societies. Those of us who are Christians know that we are called to be salt of the world. That means to give flavor and preserve, realizing how transcendent it is to fight for good. Likewise, the words of the great British thinker Edmund Burke exhort us today, pointing out that the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. Let me repeat that. The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. We must now run away from the time. We must not run away from the time we have had to leave, but we must face it with strength and courage. We must fight for ourselves, but also thinking about the future that awaits our children, putting the best of ourselves and giving our last breath so that they are going to receive it as inheritance, which is the land that brings them closer to finding truth and justice. As the great Winston Churchill said, the true statement is not the one who thinks about the next election, but the one who thinks about the next generation. Let's be brave, never give up, and never surrender. Thank you.